All right, hello, and welcome back to the Right Brain Podcast. My dad is back in Nashville.
Yes.
Very exciting.
Excited.
I tried to explain to him, I just cut these shorts myself, and I tried to explain to him that this is fashion and this is what's in, but he's sticking with he's bringing back the classic Miami Vice vibes.
Absolutely.
And that's been in lately.
And the summer's almost over, so I mean, this is like the last, so I'm kind of, last moments of summer, but yes, I'm channeling Don Johnson and Sonny Crockett, my greatest character ever on TV. But if you haven't seen Miami Vice, go back and watch it. It was the coolest show. And like I told Ellis, from a music standpoint, it was the first show that really used like pop music in the actual show. That's one of the reasons why it blew up so much.
He says pop music and he's talking about Phil Collins. But at the time, it was pop music.
Phil Collins was huge, but
we love Phil Collins.
They would use music that was even ahead of its time, meaning they would film it months in advance knowing that this song was going to blow up at that point. And it's one of the things that added to its mystique. So check it out.
He's very passionate about this. And he was explaining it to me in the Uber, like in great detail, which is what I thought he was focusing on the whole time. And then, of course, classic him, the second we got out of the Uber, he's like, Did you see that Uber driver? Did you see all his tics? And I was like, what? And he was like, he kept sniffing his nose and he kept shaking his arm.
I didn't say it like that, like judgmental, like
no, I know,
like
but
that.
It's just like, this is.
All right, but you make it sound like I'm judging people.
No, obviously he's not judging. I'm just saying it's like everywhere I go with him because this is what he does. And he's a doctor. And also, I will say my dad's whisper is louder than his regular voice, but we could talk about that another time. But
oh, that's funny.
And we went to Free People like recently, and the girl was like folding something, and you were like, "Look at her head shaking." I was like, "You are so loud! Oh my god!" But
well, first of all, from your fashion sense, of course, I trust any judgment you have because obviously your mother has trained you well. But yes, you're like a fashion icon. As opposed to, many of the, let's say, people in country music or Nashville. It's not like a fashion capital of the world, let's say. That.
We're making it. We're turning it into
It's unique. It's definitely unique to Nashville. The dresses with the white cowboy boots. And
yes, that's very, very classic
almost
Nashville.
Every bachelorette party.
Oh, yeah, big time. Okay, this is not a fashion Miami Vice podcast, even though we might have convinced you that. What we are here to talk about today is I'm actually stoked about this episode because we're talking about autism. The only autism episode we really did was like about nonverbal, and it was pretty specific, which I love that episode. But this, like, I've said a couple times, this is what my dad does on a daily basis. And there's just been so much in the news lately about Tylenol and about, what's going on. And who better than my dad to clear this all up for you guys?
Well, yeah, just so people understand, this isn't something that I just have an opinion on. The third book I wrote, which was probably my most researched book, was all about, what are some of the things that can lead to autism or other disabilities, meaning what are the causes. And again, I'm going to stay from the very beginning that it's almost impossible to prove causation, but things that might elevate the risk of having a child with autism. So this is something I know really well. I was the first person to write a book on this in 2013. It's called Autism, the Scientific Truth. And it's all based on science and research. And I interviewed, top researchers. And so, I do know a fair amount about this because I really wrote what I think is the definitive book on it. And even what's coming out now. And to be honest, even then, 13 years ago, there was good research talking about the correlation with Tylenol use and autism. So it's been around for a while. So this is something that I'm pretty passionate about and I really want to talk about because there's so much misconception. And even the way it was rolled out was just not good. It wasn't good at all. And, like I'll give you an instance. I had this family that was recently I think they were from Brazil, and they were with me this week. And I'm going through with the parent, and they have a child with autism. And the father at the end said, "Can I ask you a question?" I said, "Sure." He said, "Your government just came out and said that Tylenol causes autism." And I said, I get that you might have gotten that messaging, but first of all, that's not what it said at all. And, in many ways, that's not right. And for the most part, I would probably tell people that Tylenol doesn't cause autism, but what you can say is there is a correlation in the research between if a mom took Tylenol when they were pregnant and having a risk of autism, but that doesn't mean it caused it in any way. It may have no relationship directly in any way whatsoever, but there's a correlation. But you have to look at things like, why did the mom take the Tylenol when she was pregnant? Because maybe she had a fever. And why did she have a fever? Because she was sick, and maybe being sick and what that does might have an influence on, genes and birth and brain development and things like that. So it's just the way the messaging was rolled out was terrible. I think that the intention is good, but so that's why I want to clear this up. Like in this show, I'm going to give you I think real cutting edge information that very few people have access to, and really, educate you on what the real factors are. And, if we have a younger audience, out there who are thinking about having children, this is the reason why I wrote the book, because, one of your cousins, they were in their early 30s and they came back from a weekend out in Montauk and said, "Hey, Uncle Rob, we were sitting around with a bunch of my friends and, many of them just got married or getting married. And many of them are saying that they may not want to have kids because they're afraid of having a child that has a disability." And I was like, wow, that's terrible, right?
Yeah,
that's terrible. I understand that, but that just clearly means that they do not understand and they need information. And also, working with so many families with kids with autism around the world. And, when I say this statement, I love people with autism. I think they're brilliant. I think the world needs them in many ways. And, and there's a reason for them. But, when a family, especially parents, have a child with autism, and especially the non-speaking type, it's very, very difficult. They love their child. The child's amazing, but it's hard. And so throughout the years, many of them have come to me and said, we want to have more children, but we're concerned. Is there a way of possibly trying to make sure this doesn't happen or that it's minimized or whatever? And those are the two reasons why I wrote the book, to give people real information and real answers, and doing it without, seeming like you're putting blame or judgment on anybody, right?
Yeah, that's what you were saying is people are...
Especially on the mom, because actually when you know all the risk factors are equal between men and women, preconception, and most people don't know that. So, it's not just you putting any blame on anybody, but the idea is all of the risk factors are modifiable. You can change them or eliminate them, and so therefore lower your risk of having a child with a disability and just being the best version of them, right? We're not trying to prevent a child from autism from being born, right? They're beautiful, they should be born, they deserve to be born. But, we can have someone that has that amazing brain with that genius who doesn't have the disability, let's say, of not speaking and tics and stimming all the time.
So, okay, I want to ask the right questions because I know you have so much to say, but if you could clear that up then for some people, why would they say, it's Tylenol or whatever? I know there's things that cause your brain to develop in different ways. So what you try to explain is there's all these factors that can affect how you develop, but it's not like you take this pill and you have autism, because it's not autism isn't a disease. It's not something that you can't change. It's not something,
right.
So
right.
it's I feel like people think that it's I caught autism or,
right.
Something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, no. And that's why, I think there's been a better understanding with the neurodivergent movement, understanding that people with autism or ADHD or dyslexia or bipolar, that it's really built on personality traits.
Yeah.
So there are genetic traits, as we discuss all the time, that often can impart gifts as well and make someone really talented in an area. But if that strength is too much, it can also affect, other areas of the brain, which might result in a disability. But yeah, so let's go back to, first of all, you have to understand human brain development and its uniqueness. And I think we've talked about this before, but I don't think it can be overemphasized because very few people really understand this. And again, I have a PhD in developmental cognitive neuroscience because I wanted to understand development of the human brain, because I knew that all of these issues and imbalances went back to brain development. And so I wanted to understand everything I could about brain development, in particular human brain development, going back to the beginning of time. That's when my first book was written, looking at neurobehavioral disorders of childhood from an evolutionary perspective. Because what's the beginning? And the first question was, why do we have brains to begin with? Where did they evolve? And so the uniqueness of the human brain starts with the fact that, we have a couple things. We have the biggest brain per body size of any primate, but we also are the only bipedal primates. So we also have the smallest birth canal. So that combination right from the beginning does not exist in any other animal on the planet. So our brains have had to been modified in some way to not grow as much in the womb as other animals do. Almost every other animal, almost all of their brain is formed in the womb in a controlled setting or in an egg or something, right, where it's formed. And when they come out, they're basically almost fully formed animals and brains. Humans, we only have about 20, maybe 25% of our brain formed. And we've had to be able to restrict our genes from growing. And 84% of the genes we have are active during brain development. So that means that, and they are the most adaptable genes. Our genes have had to be restricted from growing. Our brains are so complex and so important. They're the most important genes, but they're also the most flexible genes because our brain is built to be adaptive. Since most of our brain develops outside in the environment, our brain is adapted to the environment. And that's why some researchers have called the human brain the Swiss Army knife of brains, because our brain can adapt to any environment we grow into fast, like whatever language, whatever culture, whatever food, whatever environment, if it's cold, if it's hot. Our brain is adaptable, which is one of our greatest strengths and why we've survived, but it's also our greatest vulnerability. Because if those environmental factors aren't optimal, they can also create problems with brain development, because 80% of our brain develops outside the womb, and we have the longest period of development. And most of the big stuff like speaking and attention and, focus and concentration and emotional rate happen towards the end. So any little deviations can affect the brain and how it's going to develop. But also the genes that regulate our brain, even in the womb, are very susceptible to environmental influences. So, but that also means even preconception. So that's where the risks come into play. And so there are many different factors that might alter gene expression, so that the genes that regulate brain development, especially that regulate what we call functional connectivity. So it doesn't cause damage most of the time. And it's not causing mutation to genes. It's causing an alteration of the normal growth. In most parts, I think it's slowing down the expression of the genes that build the brain and cause the brain to not be, the body's growing, let's say, different or faster than the brain is. And there's this kind of disconnect. And then that affects things, which affects the development and the stages of development. And that throws off and affects brain development and creates these imbalances And that's the root cause of what's happening. But there's many different factors that can alter our gene expression. Tylenol may be one of them. A fever may be another. The age of the mom and dad can affect it. If you're exposed to pesticides or plastics, or you have stress, all of those things may alter the expression of the genes in men and women. And the majority of the genes that you have are for brain development.
Okay. Yeah. That's making it's making it make more sense.
Yes.
Yeah. Because it's not exactly. It's not just like you took Tylenol and now your kid has autism. It's like all of these factors of things that have chemicals and are very unhealthy for you. Like you said, plastics, pesticides, all of these things, or fever, anything that changes. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So this is the second critical thing to understand. Is correlation doesn't mean causation. And this is where I think is really the big problem right now, and even the way this was rolled out, is that you can't really talk about what causes something without understanding what it is.
Yeah.
Right? So without understanding what is actually happening in the brain in autism or in any other type of childhood developmental disability, which almost all mental health issues at any age are, without understanding it, you can't point and say that's what causes it. And it's almost impossible with causation unless you can actually say, well, this is the actual mechanism in which it does that, right? So the idea with even the research that was on Tylenol, which was really good research showing a correlation, they never showed or talked about how does it cause it. Mm-hmm. And they never talked about what autism is in the brain. And so when you say there's a correlation, all you can say is that we studied these two things and found that somehow they're connected. Are they connected? They may not be. It may be just purely coincidental, or it may be causative in some way, but you have to describe, well, then how does it actually cause it? Mm-hmm. But on one hand, a lot of this came about because there has been a rise of all different types of childhood and adult mental health and developmental disabilities. And it's been a drastic rise in the last 20, 30 years. Dramatic. I mean, autism going from 1 in 10,000 to 1 in 31, right? That's huge. And so you have to look at that and say, first of all, it is a real rise. A lot of people, I've done so many interviews on this lately, and one of the first questions is it really rising or just we recognizing it? And the answer is no. And it's a whole long question and this is the first question I answer in my book, is that are we actually facing this rise, and how do we prove that? So suffice to say, it is a real rise. So then you have to say that it's not being caused by genetics or genetic mutations. It's being driven by environmental factors. So what are those factors? But when you find that, well, there's a connection between this and between, someone having a flu and an increased risk of autism, okay, but does it mean that everybody or every mother that has a flu or every father over 40 is going to have a child with autism? That's not the way it works, and it doesn't work that way. So it can't be the only factor. You know what I'm saying? There's many other factors that come into play. So all I said in my book is that these are things in the literature. These are 50 things that are really well documented that correlate with having an increased risk of having a child with a disability. And so, if you just want to, do things that might be good, I mean, obviously it's pretty clear that before you get pregnant, you should get your body in as best shape as possible. I tell people, I ran 2 marathons and I trained for a year before the marathon, and that was running a marathon. If you're thinking about having a baby, that's much more important. And for men and women, you should get your body in shape.
Yeah, men also, because a lot of men don't realize they also need to get their body in shape.
Exactly, and that's a really important thing, because when writing this book, one of the things my publisher was concerned with is we didn't want to seem like you're blaming moms, because that was done in the past. And I wanted to write it from an objective scientific standpoint that really gave real facts and information and, things that almost nobody would know. So you can't blame anybody because you're not going to know this. But
well, you said one of like your patients recently felt blamed by this, right?
Well, it was a woman that, we had interviewed on the radio show that we're a part of now, and which we have this cool thing going on a radio show now, but that she was a mom who's written two New York Times best-selling books on autism. And it was just a whole, full-page article in a New York paper this weekend. And she said her son came to her and said, "Mom, did you take Tylenol when you were pregnant?" Now, he became aware that this was out there in the news. And, of course, she felt horrible. She doesn't state whether she did or not, but imagine how mom's going to feel.
Yeah.
Because now she might feel like if I didn't take that Tylenol, I wouldn't have had a child with autism.
Right.
And I can tell you that's not how it works.
Yeah.
That there's so many different factors that come together, and there's absolutely no proof right now, beyond a shadow of doubt, that taking Tylenol would cause autism. And again, most of the women that take Tylenol are not going to have a child with autism. So it's not the only factor, and there are many other issues. But, my message in my book and in all my books is we can help change it after the fact anyway.
Yeah. And, well, yes, 100%. And also I was going to say, because you were like saying that the research is, sorry, sometimes when we're talking about scientific things, I say like a lot because I get nervous. You were saying the research is saying, oh, this causes autism, but they never said what autism actually is. So if you could give like your best definition of how you would define it.
Right. And this is why I think there's a lot of misinformation in there. But let me talk about, well, first of all, autism, according to our research, which I think is pretty extensive, and I think we've written from my lab one of the best papers ever written on the neuroanatomy and physiology of autism. So again, I'm not just speaking out of my ass on this thing, right? I'm talking about, really in some of the top journals in the world. And it is a developmental, maturational delay and imbalance, meaning where the brain in its development is kept in a more immature state, and certain areas are much more immature than others. And this leads to this developmental imbalance, in particular, where the left hemisphere, which is supposed to develop second. So we had talked about this, that the way human brain development happens and what makes it unique. So all brains on this planet have a right and left side. And that goes to the very beginning of time. How do we know that? We wrote a paper a couple of years ago, your brother and I in our lab, on the fact that really good research has shown that 500 million years ago, animals that existed would only attack from one side, which means their brains had to be lateralized from the very beginning, right? So having like a hand dominance is proof that there's a lateralized brain.
Do you guys see what I deal with? He's saying my dad and my brother wrote this paper. Like, this is what our conversations are like at dinner. I'm just like trying to chill. They're like, your brain has to be lateralized 5,000 years ago.
But we also talk about, your music and fashion and UFOs and aliens and
that's
manifestation.
True. I love UFOs and aliens.
Yes. So the idea there is that, all brains have a right and left side. But we also know that if you go up the animal kingdom, the more different the right and left side are, the more intelligent the animal is. So humans have the most difference between their right and left brain. How does it get that way? It gets that way because there are genes that make our right brain develop first. So our brain is programmed that our right brain starts to develop in the womb and takes the lead for the first 3 years. And then the left brain comes on for the next 3 years. And so what's ever happening during that time is shaping the right brain and the left brain to do different things. And once that foundation is set by 6 years of age, it only becomes more that way. Now, anything that disrupts that alters that sequence or alters that delicate balance is going to result in some effect on the brain and is going to result in some effect on brain development and mental health. Now, in autism, I believe what's happening is we have people that have natural traits, strong trait to be left brain dominant. And again, there's different subtypes of that. And, classically, we talk about it as the engineering brain, right? So the parents, and these means that, and this is a good thing. I mean, people that are left brain dominant do incredibly well in academics and school, and they're brilliant and great with math and science and reading and words and, all of those things. They have, the photographic memories and amazing things. But too much of that and if that left brain comes online too early before the age of 3, it stops right brain development and then develops too much of an imbalance. And an extreme version of that is autism, to me. Now, again, nothing's damaged, nothing's broken. And again, this is why you have these kids that virtually all of them, especially the non-speaking ones, are geniuses. I mean, they're incredible. They have photographic memories. I had this one kid this week who was completely non-speaking up to the age of 12, then came to see us. And we work with him to correct this imbalance, but also to help him, give him a voice. So he started using a letterboard. And before that, he had never said a word his whole life. And nobody thought he knew anything. So they never really even tried to teach him because he would get really aggressive at times and bite people and bite himself. And he was ticking and stimming all the time. And so they didn't think he was, in traditional school, they didn't think he was teachable. So meanwhile, once the family realized that this kid is brilliant, and on the letterboard the first day he started speaking in full sentences to them and saying all these things that only he would know, they started teaching him with homeschooling using letterboard. And now this kid came and we just tested him with this academic achievement test. That's the top test in neuropsychology that we do all the time. And by using a letterboard, he was able to do the test. And he is now reading at a college level. So this is a kid who was 14 years old, who a year ago, they didn't think he could read one letter. And now we test him, and in 1 year, he's able to show us that he's reading at a college level word reading.
Wow.
But his reading comprehension is at like a 4th grade level. And that's a right brain skill. So now you're talking about the difference between his left brain and right brain skill is still, like 8 years. And that imbalance is where the problem lies.
Right.
And that's what autism is to me. So then you have to look and say, if you look at just a metabolic function, like having a folate deficiency, and we'll talk about that because that's the whole thing with Tylenol, or having, reduced vitamin, or having pesticides, or having some chemical in your body that might be toxic, you have to look and say that's going to affect all the genes and all the brain cells equally, right? So that's not what we see in autism. There are areas, first of all, there is no damage. People talk about it as a brain injury. It's not. And talk about it as a genetic mutation. Again, it's not, basically. But what we see is that there's this imbalance where areas of their brain are functioning and overactive and overconnected and maybe even faster than normal in their connections. And then other areas of the brain are very delayed and immature. And literally, when you look at the brain, that's the only abnormality you find, is that areas of the brain seem like they look very immature in growth and others look more mature. And that's pretty much it. They don't have damage. They don't have a deficit of cells. If anything, they may have too many cells or too many connections, which is immaturity. And so by one metabolic problem, like toxins or pesticides, how does that create that imbalance? We could all, if you have a toxic insult to the brain, it affects the whole brain. I mean, I've seen people that have really been injured by a chemical or by something, and they're like in wheelchairs, and they are, they're completely non-functioning.
Sorry, I'm laughing because the parasite thing that I said yesterday.
Yes. Well, yeah, that's a little different also, but yeah, and that's the thing. There's so many misconceptions out there, and it really comes down to people don't understand the brain development, and brain function. And I think the biggest thing right now out there, which kind of relates to the Tylenol thing, is around what's called folate metabolism, because along with that came out this big thing about this new kind of drug called leucovorin. It's really not new, but really it basically provides what's called folic acid. So now, and this has been a big thing, and I can kind of disprove why it really isn't a big thing and why it's been very hyped up and overblown, and it's not anywhere near as important as people think it is. And there's so much misconceptions out there. And right now, that's the big thing. Oh, leucovorin is going to be the key, and it's not. And folic acid metabolism and problems with that are not the primary problem in any way. And there's so many people out there that think that's it, that it all comes down to folate metabolism. It's completely wrong.
Wow.
And I can disprove that right now.
Oh, bring it on. Let's hear it.
So first of all, do you know what?
I love when you get matter of fact. You're like, it's not. Thanks.
Yep. And because again, my search has been looking for the root cause. My search has been coming up with a universal model that explains all of these things because for me, if you don't have a model that explains every variation of something, then you don't really understand it. So for me, autism and many things are called a spectrum. What does that mean? It means there's very, very different variations. You can have people on the autism spectrum that are extremely verbal, articulate, incredibly so, very smart, very functioning, but yet, struggle with things like socialization or emotional regulation or have tics or stimming or OCD. And then you have others on the other end of it that are completely non-speaking and really not really functional in that they have no control over their body and their movements. Some may have, a lot of metabolic issues and inflammation. Others may have almost none. Some may have food sensitivities and others may have none. How do you explain all of that, right? So first of all, we wrote a paper in 2009 about this, that the way you explain it is that, especially when you're talking about all the biomedical stuff that's been known for years, that people in autism and other disabilities have reduced acid in their stomach. They have less digestive enzymes. They have less B12. They have problems with folic acid. They have increased autoimmunity. They have problems detoxifying their body. And all of those things, right? All of them. We showed in a paper in 2009 that all of that can be explained by this developing imbalance in the nervous system and in the brain between the hemispheres, but also primarily an imbalance between the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. And so right now, folic acid is really considered a vitamin. It's really not a naturally occurring vitamin in our body, but it is something that we do need. And we usually naturally get it through food, and we naturally need to break it down and then metabolize it to use it. And folic acid and B12, give what's called methyl molecules, which are very important for what's called methylation in the body. And they do serve as a basis of a lot of enzymes and different things that break down in the body, and they are important for the brain. But here's the thing. So this is the big thing that I'm going to kind of go against here.
Okay. For
a long time, especially in the world of people that say vaccines cause autism. I've said it before, and again, I know, and believe me, I'm not saying this to hurt people or say it in any way, because I know there are people out there that firmly, absolutely believe it, and I get it, but I'm just going to use this from a logical standpoint. And even the most staunch people, when you say this fact, they go, okay, so if vaccines caused autism, then everybody that was ever vaccinated would have autism. Does that make sense? Okay. So if you say that, then even people that are the staunchest vaccine, people will say, yes, well, okay, but there's something with these children that affects them that with the vaccine that others don't. Okay, let's accept that and say, okay, well, what's that other thing? Isn't that other thing the most important thing? And so what happened was down the road, there was some researchers, and one in particular that said there's this thing called the MTHFR gene, and it's a gene, the methyl tetrahydrofolate reductase gene. Whenever you hear ACE, that means it's an enzyme. What do enzymes do? They act as catalysts, or they break down things for reactions in the body, right? So there's been known for a while that some people may genetically have different versions of that gene, and some genes are really good to metabolize folic acid, others are not. And the ones that have less of it may have a tendency to have less folic acid, and therefore the thinking is that they aren't able to methylate, they're not able to metabolize, they're not able to detoxify, so that when they get something like a vaccine, they can't detoxify things that might be in it, and it causes more of a problem with them and leads to inflammation, and somehow that's supposed to cause autism in the child, right?
Okay.
Doesn't really make sense neurologically, because that wouldn't cause what we see in autism anyway. But you have to go back and say, okay, so is that the real thing? If you have this MTHFR gene version and you get vaccinated, or you have some other sort of toxin in the child, that's going to produce autism. And that's completely not true, right? So meaning I just had 2 moms recently in my office, and one of them said to me at the end, she said, what do you think of this MTHFR gene thing? Like, is that real or is that a hype? And I said to her, no, it's really hype mostly. What do you think? And she said, yeah, because I had all my kids tested because I was told it was a big thing. And my child who was autistic had the best version of the MTHFR gene. And my highest functioning child, which is my daughter, who's a superstar in everything, had the worst version of the MTHFR gene. But all of them had been vaccinated. And it didn't make any sense, because it doesn't, right? So that's the thing. And listen, there's a whole industry and a lot of the whole, autism treatment world and biomedical world is all built around this. And to me, they don't, none of them know anything about the brain and neurology, and are talking about that.
Well, it comes back to also what you were just saying in the beginning, where it's like, yeah, there are a lot of things that if they're bad for your body and they're bad chemical makeups and all this stuff, then the way your brain is developing can be altered, and that can end up as you having autism, or
could affect the expression of the genes that build the brain. But again, they're talking about in the child. So most of the risk factors are in the parents, not the child. You understand? There are some in the child, but most of the risk factors that are known to be correlated are preconception factors that happen in men and women.
That's so crazy.
Right? So that's another thing, like the Tylenol thing, right? That's not preconception, but that's prenatal. So now this is the other thing, and this is where I'll kind of, with the leucovorin thing, and with this, another part of it, how did that become so big, right? Because leucovorin's been out for a long time. So there was the development of this test called the FRAT test, the folate receptor antibody test. And what they showed in this test was that kids with, or people with autism, like 75% of them have antibodies against that receptor, where the typical population doesn't. So again, they looked at it like, oh, they have antibodies. Because, part of the question is, all right, well, why aren't they metabolizing folate? Meaning if they're getting it naturally in their diet or whatever, what would interfere with the metabolism of folic acid? And there's a lot of factors, but one may be the MTHFR gene for a little bit, but that's probably the least important. And then, so they're looking at, okay, well, part of the factor is because there's these antibodies against the receptor, and folic acid can't activate the receptors and whatever, right? So the two main things is if there's a problem with folic acid absorption and metabolism, that may affect methylation, which might affect a lot of different things, and detox in the brain and all that. And then there's also if they have antibodies against these receptors, and people are looking at that, that's the root cause, and that's the main problem. Even though none of those things alone, to me, you wouldn't be able to describe a folic acid deficiency actually producing what we see in the brain. But there's two more root questions that they don't ask. One, why do these kids have more antibodies than others for everything in their body? And that comes down to an imbalance in what we call the Th1 and Th2 system, and their imbalance in their immune system. And then the other thing is folic acid needs acid in the stomach to be able to be digested and absorbed. If you have an increased sympathetic tone, which we've proven and many people have, that is present in people with autism and all different types of developmental disabilities, anybody that has a developmental delay, they're in this fight or flight state because of the immaturity in their brainstem and their medulla. And what that does is, one of the things it does is it affects the production of acid and digestive enzymes in the gut, right? So this is a thing I Googled right before we got here. So the question is, do you need acid or enzymes in the gut to be able to absorb and metabolize folate? Okay. So yes, while not strictly required for folic acid itself, stomach acid is essential for releasing dietary folate from food proteins and converting it into a form the body can absorb. And a low stomach pH is optimal for the enzyme mucosal conjunctase, which is necessary for folate absorption. Conditions causing achlorhydria, which no stomach acid, or hypochlorhydria, low stomach, can impair absorption naturally occurring folate, and through supplement it's easier. So the other thing is that it also says that naturally occurring folate in foods is bound to proteins and must be released by digestive enzymes.
Wait, I'm going to need you to
what does that mean?
Talk to me like I'm in 5th grade.
So basically what that means is that if you don't produce enough stomach acid or digestive enzymes, you can't absorb or process folate, no matter how much you get in your food. And so when you look at the brain and brain development, there's what we call the sympathetic, which is the fight or flight system. That's mainly like if you're in danger or if you have a sense of danger, then your heart rate goes up and your blood flow to your gut shuts down. Your acid and enzymes to your gut shuts down. Your movement shuts down. The blood is sent to your arms and your legs and your brain for fighting or running away. Okay? And that should be a short-term thing that happens when you're in danger. We're also born that way. We're born in that state. And the balance to that is what's called the parasympathetic. Maybe a lot of people hear it as the vagal system or the vagus nerve, but it's really a whole system called the parasympathetic. And we're not born with that online. That needs to develop over the first year. And as it does, it inhibits the sympathetic. And our heart rate goes down. And that's one of the ways that you know. Like you can measure the balance of sympathetic and parasympathetic by looking at resting heart rate, or what's called heart rate variability. And so the bottom line is, we've shown, and many other people have shown, and we published a paper 2 years ago showing that there's an increased heart rate and decreased heart rate variability in people with autism, and they're in this sympathetic state all the time, and the parasympathetic didn't develop. So they have a leaky open gut. They don't produce acid and enzymes at the level that they should. They don't have blood flow to absorb a lot of the vitamins and minerals. And that is where all of the metabolic things that come around. And that's where you can't absorb folate. You can't absorb B12 without acid in the stomach. And so the bottom line is that a lot of people look at this and say, again, well, these kids may have a problem with folate metabolism, and it's because of this MTHFR gene, or it's because of these receptors, and that's the root cause. No, the root cause is, why do they have these antibodies? against the receptor more than other people? Why do they have malabsorption of these things? And it comes down to imbalances in the brain and the nervous system that are the root cause of the immune imbalance and the problem with the gut digestion and all of that. And that leads to this imbalance in the brain, which is this root cause of all of the symptoms we see.
That was what was supposed to be better. Sorry. Damn.
Well, you didn't get the whistling from me. You know, I can't whistle out.
Yeah.
I can only blow out and go like.
That's true. But you can do a lot of more impressive things, like help kids with autism. So it's fine.
Was that clear though? Like, do you think?
Yes, I mean, I'm a little bit dumb, but
you're not dumb. You're a genius with your right brain.
But no, it was clear. And also it was very exciting. I love when you talk about these things like passionately. It's like, it's very exciting. I feel like I'm watching like The Social Network.
Well, you know, I've never been, because a lot of people have said to me,
movie.
You know, why don't more people know about this stuff? Why don't more people know about your work? And why doesn't everybody know this? Because once you hear it, it's kind of like, oh, because, you know, when I dive into something, I dive into it deep.
Well,
you know?
That's what I always like, because I grew up going to your lectures and I've watched people just like pop up and be like, oh yeah, well, what about this? And you're like, I'm glad you asked. And then you have like the answer for it. So it's like, you never get tripped up. You always have an answer for the question, and you know your research so well. So it's like, I don't know. It's like you always know what to say and what the answer is, and you've done this for so long that it must be frustrating for you when you're like watching a show and they're like, all right, everyone, stop taking Tylenol and autism will be gone, you know, and it's like so much more complicated. So yeah, why do you think that it's been so hard for your information to become mainstream?
Well, I think it is a lot of different factors, but I think a lot of it is that, you know, the average medical doctor, the average healthcare practitioner, MDs, naturopaths, they understand biochemistry, they understand metabolism, they understand infectious disease, and that's where they live, right? Because that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to manipulate biochemistry with pills or medication or whatever, right? And so, you know, that's more common. That's what they're taught, you know, even though, you know, most MDs don't learn anything about nutrition or diet in school. They think biochemically. And so the thinking is that, you know, by understanding the little biochemical reactions, you know, that's what we need to do. And that's the whole basis of pharmacy and everything. And, you know, to me, that's not. What's more important is looking at it from a bigger picture, from the whole body, instead of trying to break down little chemical reactions. And it comes down to understanding how it all works together as an integrated system. And the basis of that is the brain and the nervous system and what we call functional neuroscience, meaning how does the brain and nervous system actually do what it does? How does it process information? How does it influence the body? How does it affect things? And, you know, I've spent over 30 years studying that at the highest level to understand that. And quite frankly, very few people do. And I think understanding the brain and the nervous system and how it works to control an integrated system is much harder than trying to just understand the biochemical reactions in the body, quite honestly. Not that, you know, the immune system is very complicated, but the brain regulates the immune system, and how they work together is really, I think, you know, where a lot of our research is going now. So I think that very few doctors and healthcare workers out there have any clue of how the brain actually functions, works, and develops, especially how it develops, and how it works to control all the different systems in the body, and looking at, so that very few people out there really understand or have any clue about the root cause. So then they look at, and you know, traditional medicine looks at pieces, right? It's very left brain. It looks at individual pieces, not the whole. That's the whole idea of holistic medicine. Most people that are in healthcare are more right brain. They're more nurturing. They're empathetic. They look things from a big picture. And that's why holistic medicine, where traditional medicine, allopathic, is very left brain and very looks at individual pieces. That's why everybody's highly specialized, and you only look at a kidney patient and don't dare comment on if the kidney is affecting the heart, because that's a cardiologist, right?
Right.
And how's the immune system work with that? And, I remember I talked to a top pediatric cardiologist many years ago, and talk to him about what's called the polyvagal system and how the sympathetic and parasympathetic regulate the heart. And he had no idea. He didn't know anything about it, like literally nothing. And it was like, you know everything about the heart. Wouldn't you think you know about how the brain and the nervous system regulate the heart? And he was like, well, no, that's a neurologist there. Like, okay, but that's the thing. They look at the body as individual pieces.
Yeah.
That's not the way it works. It all works together. And so therefore, I think I've just naturally thought that way from the beginning, and I've trained myself to understand all these systems and how they work. And I think that's part of the problem, because the majority of the noise out there is about, like, it's folic acid metabolism, it's a digestive enzyme problem, it's a pesticide problem, or without really saying, well, first of all, what is it and how does that cause that? And I think it's more sophisticated knowledge. And I think the more sophisticated something is, you don't have as wide an audience. We talked about that with music, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So, and also just to remind all our listeners, we are the right brain because creatives are higher right brain most of the time, left brain deficit, and on the autism spectrum, like we're talking about, it's actually the opposite.
Yeah, and it doesn't mean that
it
doesn't also mean that the left brain doesn't have creative abilities as well, and that people in the autism world aren't also creative, or that people that have left brain dominance aren't creative in their thinking. It's a different form of creativity.
Right. I was explaining it like a right brain person.
Yeah, and that's how most people out there think about it. Like, the creatives are the right brain types, and that's true to a certain extent. But by strict definition of creativity, it's not 100% true. But
also, would you use a brain driver on?
Because the brain driver to me is one of the greatest tools that's developed, or it is transcranial direct current. So why? Because really all of the symptoms of any of these issues, whether it's, adult mental health issues or anxiety or whatever that we've talked about, come down to these imbalances in the networks in the brain. So how do you balance things out? One of the things we talked about is doing things like bottom up, like working with primitive reflexes, or looking at, well, why are they imbalanced to begin with? But then being able to directly, dampen one side that's overactive and boost up the other in very specific locations in the brain. How do you do this? There's not a lot of tools out there that can do that. And the transcranial direct current in the brain driver in particular has been shown, and it's research shown, is that literally can be used if you place the pads in the right way to create balance, where it can take down or dampen one area a little bit and bring up the other in a gentle, really safe way. And so it's an incredible tool when it's used as part of, an integrated system.
Yeah.
But it's just, I think, a brilliant tool that really can do something that very few, and it's very safe for anybody to use it. It's battery operated basically. So it's not like electroshock therapy or anything like that. And, even though it can feel fairly strong at times, it's really a gentle way of helping to nudge the brain back into balance. But you need to make sure you're using it on the right sides, because if you don't, then it can put you out of balance the other way. But then you can figure that out.
Okay, so I think maybe I kept up pretty well with all the things that you were saying. Those were some high up scientific words you were using at some points.
That's true.
So I tried to be like, totally, yeah. I'm you know what, I'm not going to try. But
you were like when Kevin James was on Joe Rogan talking about my work, and he went, yeah, I'm not a doctor. I'm not going to explain what he does, but it's like, oh, Kevin, you're not a doctor. Okay, I get that. It was pretty funny.
This might come as a shock to you guys. I am also not a doctor.
Didn't you say you're a pop star, not a doctor?
Oh yeah, I'm a pop star, not a doctor. That's a Drake quote. Okay. In closing statements for this awesome episode, what would you say?
Honestly, without sounding like I'm plugged, if you really are interested in looking at some of the things that might elevate the risk, and you really want to have the real information, read my book, Autism, the Scientific Truth, Diagnosing, Treating, and Preventing Autism Spectrum, and What Parents Can Do Now. That book came out in 2013.
That's pretty straightforward of a title, guys.
Yeah. So, I mean, in the book, I spent 2-3 years really writing it and putting it together. It's a lot of it, and everything that they're talking about now and that they're going to come out with, pretty much guarantee I already put it in the book. But I explained it in a way that is useful and helpful. And the bottom line is the best way to use it is to really read it before you're getting pregnant, right? I mean, just like anything, and for any. If you want to know how do I have the healthiest baby with the best brain and the best, how do I do that? And like I said, right now, 1 in 4 children being born are going to have some sort of diagnosis. That's scary. And how do you lower the risk? You can't say, how do we prevent it? How do we guarantee we're not going to have that? And again, the more talented your child is, the more risk or vulnerability they will have. But how do you lower your risk of having a child? Read my book, and I actually have a 10-step system where you can do blood tests and do things and measure. All of these factors are measurable. And they're equal in men and women. So a guy and a girl, both who are thinking about having a baby, should read this book, understand it, look at, maybe get some of these blood tests done to see what their levels of inflammatory chemicals is and what their immune reactivity is. And do they have toxic chemicals in their body? Do they have the proper balance of hormones, right? All of these things. And then you can work with someone to change that and get things into optimal ranges. And that's going to lower your risk. I can tell you that anybody that I worked with, that I did preconception counseling with in my practice, never had a second child with autism.
Those are some...
And that's hundreds of people, really. So, can I say that we absolutely prevented autism, or that these things that we work with, or they absolutely would have had a child? No, we can't say any of that. But all we know is they did have it before. And even though only 18% of siblings do have autism, so there's only less than a 20% chance that they would have had a kid, I have 0%. So, we're better than the statistics, especially in families that already had a kid with autism, right? So, and those kids had the same personality traits and were brilliant and are geniuses, but they weren't diagnosed with autism. So that's the reason for it. And that's where I think that, get real information. And so I think, the best way I can explain it to you is read the book. That's what I wrote it for.
Okay, great. You heard it here, guys. I'm not going to say the title of the book because it was a long title, but it says autism in it like 3 times, so you guys can find it.
Big writing on a white cover says autism.
Figure it out. You can do that. Yeah. Okay, well, thank you, Dr. Rob. That was very informative.
Thank you. I hope it helped people, and it feels good to be able to get this real information out there, because, I'm not the type of person that's going to force this down anyone's throat or go out there and say, you people are all idiots, listen to me.
That's why you have this daughter. Right. You people are all idiots, listen to him.
And that's why I love you.
Okay, I love you too. Until next time.
I love you.